On a bright Sunday morning in June 1864, 15,000 spectators lined the cliffs of Cherbourg, France. They had come by railway from Paris, packed the harbor walls, and climbed into the rigging of anchored ships. Below them, two warships were about to fight the most watched naval battle since Trafalgar. But this was not a clash of empires. This was something far stranger. A single Confederate raider, hunted across 3 oceans and 75,000 miles of open water, finally cornered by her American pursuer. In the next 70 minutes, the fate of CSS Alabama and her legendary captain would be decided. The story begins not in America, but in a grimy shipyard on the English coast, where a secret warship was being built to wage a new kind of war, a war on commerce. In the summer of 1861, a Confederate agent named James Dunwoody Bullock arrived in Liverpool with a dangerous mission. The Confederacy had no navy. It had no warships. What it did have was cotton money and a plan. Bullock approached John Laird Sons and Company in Birkenhead, across the River Mersey from Liverpool. The contract called for a fast wooden screw steamer, nothing more. The ship was listed in the yard ledger simply as Hull 290. The cover story was that she would serve in the East Indies trade. But this was no merchantman. Hidden within her elegant lines were reinforced decks designed to bear the weight of heavy cannon. Below her waterline, an ammunition magazine waited to be filled. Her coal bunkers could carry enough fuel for 18 days of continuous steaming, and a revolutionary lifting propeller could be raised clear of the water in 15 minutes, allowing her to transform into a pure sailing ship. She was, in every respect, a wolf dressed in merchant's clothing. The specifications were impressive. 220 feet long, with a beam of 32 feet, she displaced over 1,000 tons. Her twin horizontal steam engines could drive her at 13 knots under power alone. But it was under sail that she truly excelled. With her tall masts and efficient rig, she could make 10 knots with a favorable wind, and her narrow hull sliced through waves with remarkable grace. She was built to hunt, fast enough to catch any merchant vessel, nimble enough to outrun most warships. The American consul in Liverpool, Thomas Dudley, knew something sinister was taking shape. He sent spies into the shipyard. He gathered affidavits from workers who described military fittings. The American minister in London, Charles Francis Adams, bombarded the British Foreign Office with warnings, but British law contained a loophole wide enough to sail a warship through. It was illegal to arm a ship for war in British ports, but building an unarmed vessel was perfectly legal. The Confederates were careful. The guns would come later. The diplomatic dance grew increasingly tense. Prime Minister Palmerston's government was officially neutral, but many in Britain's upper classes sympathized with the Confederacy. Southern cotton fed British mills, and the aristocracy saw the Confederacy as a kindred spirit, a genteel agrarian society, standing against Northern industrial democracy. Adams worked frantically to gather evidence, knowing that once the ship sailed, it would be too late. On July 28, 1862, Hull 290 was dressed with bunting and flags. A celebration, witnesses were told. A trial voyage down the Mersey. Guests came aboard. A band played. Wine was served. Then quietly, the guests disembarked. The ship, now called Enrica, kept going. She steamed past the breakwater, into the Irish Sea, and vanished. British authorities issued a seizure order the next day. They were 24 hours too late. 3 weeks later, in the Portuguese Azores, 3 ships rendezvoused in international waters. The bark Agrippina carried 8 heavy guns, ammunition, and coal. The steamer Bahama carried Captain Raphael Semmes and 24 Confederate officers, and between them floated the sleek black hull of Enrica. For 3 days, sailors worked without rest, hoisting cannon onto their mounts, loading shells into the magazine, filling coal bunkers. The armament was formidable: 6 32-pounders in broadside, 1 8-inch smoothbore pivot gun, and 1 massive Blakely 100-pound rifled cannon. Together, these guns could throw over 400 pounds of iron in a single broadside. On August 24, 1862, the work was complete. The crew assembled on the quarterdeck. Semmes climbed atop a gun carriage and read his commission from President Jefferson Davis. A signal gun fired. The British colors came down. The Confederate battle flag rose in their place, Hull 290 was now CSS Alabama. She would never see a Confederate port. She would never return to England. For the next 22 months, she would haunt the shipping lanes of three oceans, and the name Alabama would become synonymous with terror on the high seas. The man who would command this ghost ship was no young firebrand. Raphael Semmes was 52 years old, a career naval officer with graying temples and a carefully waxed mustache that curled to precise points on either side of his lean face. He had served 36 years in the United States Navy. He had survived a shipwreck in the Mexican-American War, commanded blockade ships, and practiced law during his shore leaves. He was also a student of international maritime law, a detail that would prove essential. Born in Maryland, educated at sea, Semmes had commanded everything from revenue cutters to ships of the line. He was a published author, having written a well-regarded account of the Mexican War. He was meticulous, calculating, and utterly dedicated to the Confederate cause. Before Alabama, Semmes had commanded CSS Sumter, a converted packet steamer that captured 18 Union vessels before mechanical failures stranded her at Gibraltar. From that experience, Semmes developed a brutal efficiency. He knew that Confederate raiders could not bring prizes into port. The Union blockade and international pressure made that impossible. So he would burn them instead. His methods were systematic. Approach under false colors, British usually or American, fire a warning shot, board the target, examine her papers. If the ship was American, and her cargo American, the verdict was swift. Strip her of anything useful, transfer her crew, and put her to the torch. Yet Semmes was no pirate. He followed the laws of war with almost academic precision. Neutral cargo on American ships was often spared. Crews were treated as prisoners of war, fed from Alabama's stores, and released at the first neutral port. In 22 months, Semmes took more than 2,000 prisoners. Not one was harmed through accident or disease. His executive officer, John McIntosh Kell, described the crew as made up from all the seafaring nations of the globe. British sailors, Irish dockworkers, Yankee deserters, and a nucleus of Southern pilots from Savannah and New Orleans. Many had signed on for adventure and double wages paid in gold. What they got was endless blue water, strict discipline, and the constant thrill of the hunt. Life aboard Alabama followed naval routine. The crew rose at daybreak, scrubbed the decks, maintained the rigging, and drilled at the guns. Semmes was a strict disciplinarian but not cruel. He stopped the traditional rum ration, considering alcohol a vice that weakened fighting men. Instead, he offered better food and regular pay. Every Sunday, weather permitting, he held divine services on the quarterdeck, reading from Scripture with the same precision he applied to navigation. The officers kept their quarters neat, their uniforms pressed, their swords polished. This was not a pirate ship. This was a warship of the Confederate States Navy, and Semmes intended to maintain every appearance of legitimacy. Alabama's first victims never saw her coming. In early September 1862, the Western Azores teemed with American whaling ships pursuing the sperm whale migration. On September 5th, Captain Abraham Osborne of the whaler Ocmulgee was in the middle of stripping blubber from a freshly killed whale when a black-hulled steamer approached flying American colors. Minutes later, Osborne and his 37 crewmen were prisoners, watching their ship burn to the waterline. Over the next 2 weeks, Semmes destroyed 9 whaling vessels in rapid succession. The Starlight, the Ocean Rover, the Alert, the Weather Gauge. Each capture followed the same pattern: false colors, a warning shot, the terrible reveal of the Confederate flag, and finally the flames. One captain, believing Semmes was joking, laughed until he saw the Confederate ensign rise, then the color drained from his face. News traveled slowly across the Atlantic. By the time the whaling fleet understood what was happening, Alabama had vanished. Semmes understood that commerce raiding was strategic warfare. The goal was not to defeat the Union Navy. That was impossible. The goal was to make American shipping so dangerous that merchants would refuse to sail, insurance rates would become unaffordable, and Northern public opinion would turn against the war. That October, Alabama crossed the Atlantic to intercept the grain trade on the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. American ships carrying wheat to Europe were fat, slow targets. The ship Brilliant was so large that an English witness described her burning as a sight as grand as it was appalling. Her captain begged Semmes for mercy. There was none. The cargo, wheat desperately needed in Europe, went to the bottom along with the ship. By November, Alabama had taken 20 prizes in less than 3 months. Back in New York, the Herald newspaper demanded answers. "Can one vessel do as she pleases on the high seas?" the editors asked. "And we, with all our resources of ships, guns, men, and money, be unable to prevent it?" It was a question that would torment Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles for 2 years. Insurance companies began refusing coverage for American vessels or demanding premiums so high that shipping became unprofitable. Shipowners transferred registry to British and other neutral flags by the hundreds. The Stars and Stripes was disappearing from the world's oceans, driven into hiding by a single Confederate raider. Welles dispatched warship after warship to hunt Alabama. At any given time, a dozen Federal cruisers were searching for her. USS Vanderbilt, USS San Jacinto, USS Tuscarora, and many others. But the oceans were vast, and Semmes was cunning. His strategy was simple. Never stay in one place for more than a few weeks. Strike a shipping lane, burn everything in sight, then disappear before the hunters could converge. When he heard that USS Vanderbilt was searching for him near Cape Town, he simply changed course for the Indian Ocean. When intelligence suggested USS Wyoming was patrolling the Sunda Strait, he spread false rumors that he was actually a Union warship, confusing his pursuers. The near misses were extraordinary. In March 1863, Alabama was coaling at Fernando de Noronha, a Brazilian island, when USS Mohican arrived searching for her. Semmes slipped away in darkness, passing within miles of his hunter. Off the Cape of Good Hope, Alabama and USS Vanderbilt were searching for each other simultaneously, each only bows behind the other's track. At Singapore, Semmes learned that USS Wyoming had anchored there just 3 days before his arrival. The ships circled each other like blind dancers, never quite making contact. In 22 months, Alabama boarded 447 vessels and captured 65 of them, an average of nearly 1 prize per week during her peak hunting periods. The value destroyed approached $6 million, roughly $120 million in today's currency. But beyond the direct losses, the psychological impact was devastating. American shipping was paralyzed by fear of the ghost ship that appeared from nowhere, struck without warning, and vanished like smoke. On January 11, 1863, Alabama approached the Texas coast near Galveston. Semmes planned to attack Union transports supporting the Federal invasion. What he found instead was a Confederate flag flying over the city. Galveston had just been recaptured, and 5 Union blockade ships offshore. One of them, USS Hatteras, steamed out to investigate the strange vessel on the horizon. Alabama lured her nearly 20 miles from the squadron, waiting until darkness fell. Then came the traditional hailing ceremony. "What ship is that?" Alabama's officer replied coolly. "Her Majesty's ship Petrel." Hatteras identified herself. There was a pause. Then Lieutenant Kell's voice boomed across the water. "This is the Confederate States steamer Alabama." The broadside that followed was devastating. Alabama's guns, loaded and aimed during the conversation, fired simultaneously. Shells tore through Hatteras's thin wooden hull. The Union gunboat returned fire, but in the darkness and confusion, most shots went wide. Alabama circled like a shark, pouring broadside after broadside into the stricken vessel. Within 13 minutes, Hatteras was sinking. Alabama's boats rescued all survivors except 2 men killed in the action, the first combat deaths of the entire cruise. One officer from Hatteras later wrote that Alabama's gunnery was the most accurate I have ever witnessed. The next morning, the Union squadron at Galveston realized what had happened and gave chase. By then, Alabama was 100 miles away. Through 1863 and into 1864, Alabama prowled the shipping lanes of 3 continents. She took prizes off Brazil, capturing so many vessels that Semmes commissioned one of them, the bark Conrad, as a Confederate tender, renaming her CSS Tuscaloosa. The prize carried prisoners and supplies, extending Alabama's reach. In August 1863, she arrived at Cape Town, where British colonists wined and dined her officers. The visit was so celebrated that it inspired an Afrikaans folk song, "Daar kom die Alabama," "Here comes the Alabama." British subjects lined the docks, cheering as Alabama steamed into harbor. Semmes and his officers were feted at balls and dinners. It was a propaganda victory as valuable as any ship burned. She crossed the Indian Ocean, passed through the Sunda Strait within 25 miles of her American pursuer without either ship knowing, and reached Singapore in December 1863. There, her officers noticed something remarkable. More than 20 northern merchant ships sat at anchor, rotting unemployed. American shipping had gone into hiding. Insurance rates had climbed to 10% of cargo value, a crippling surcharge. Many American captains had transferred their vessels to British registry just to escape Alabama's shadow. Semmes had achieved his strategic goal. But the ship herself was dying. Nearly 2 years at sea had taken a terrible toll. Alabama's boilers were corroded with salt. Her copper bottom was dragging barnacles and seaweed. Seams that had been tight in 1862 now leaked. Some of her hull beams had split. The green English oak used in her hurried construction was finally giving way. Water pumps ran constantly. Carpenters stuffed oakum into widening gaps between planks. The ship that had once made 13 knots now struggled to reach 10. Her ammunition was even worse. The powder in her magazine had absorbed moisture from the nearby condensing apparatus, turning what should have been explosive shells into dangerous duds. A test firing revealed the problem, but there was nothing to be done. Without access to a proper Navy yard, Alabama was slowly falling apart. Her crew was equally worn. Months without prizes had made them nearly mutinous. The excitement of the early captures had faded into monotony. Officers began wearing sidearms on deck. Semmes himself was exhausted. "I am supremely disgusted with the sea," he wrote in his journal. "I am past the age when men ought to be subjected to its hardships." His health was failing. The constant stress, poor food, and tropical diseases had taken their toll. But he refused to give up. He had orders to return to Europe for a refit. In June 1864, Alabama limped into Cherbourg, France, desperately seeking repairs. The French authorities offered limited assistance. France was officially neutral and could not openly aid a Confederate warship. Semmes began making arrangements to dock Alabama and begin the long process of rebuilding her for another cruise. And then, 3 days later, a black-hulled warship appeared outside the breakwater. USS Kearsarge had found her at last. Captain John Winslow had spent over a year hunting Alabama across European waters. Now, finally, his quarry was trapped. Kearsarge took station outside Cherbourg Harbor, blocking both exits. Semmes faced a choice. He could remain in port indefinitely, slowly interned, his ship rotting at anchor while his legend faded. Or he could fight. On June 14th, he sent a message through diplomatic channels. "I desire to say to the U.S. consul that my intention is to fight the Kearsarge as soon as I can make the necessary arrangements." It was not merely bravado. Semmes calculated that the ships were evenly matched. Both were wooden-hulled sloops of similar size and armament. Both carried roughly the same number of guns. Both had experienced crews. What Semmes did not know, or chose to ignore, was that Kearsarge had a secret. Heavy anchor chains hung along her midsection, covered by wooden planking, providing makeshift armor for her vulnerable machinery. More critically, Kearsarge's bottom was clean, her powder fresh, her crew drilled to perfection. Alabama was exhausted. Semmes spent 5 days preparing. His crew painted the ship, cleaned her guns, and practiced their battle drills. Many aboard had doubts. The chief engineer reported that the engines might fail under the strain of combat. The master gunner worried about the deteriorated powder. But Semmes was determined. To refuse battle would be dishonorable. He consulted his officers. They voted unanimously to fight. The crew, hearing of the decision, cheered. After 2 years of burning unarmed merchantmen, they would finally face a real warship in open combat. On Sunday morning, June 19, 1864, Alabama steamed out of Cherbourg Harbor. A French ironclad escorted her to the 3-mile limit of territorial waters, ensuring the battle would occur in international waters. Behind them came the British yacht Deerhound and several pilot boats filled with spectators. 15,000 people watched from shore. Cafes and restaurants along the waterfront filled with customers eager for a view. Artists set up easels to sketch the scene. It was, in every sense, a spectator sport, the last great single-ship duel of the Age of Sail. At approximately 11 o'clock, the ships closed to engagement range. Alabama fired first, her broadside cutting rigging but mostly falling short. The range was still too great. Kearsarge held her fire until the range closed to 900 yards. Then Winslow gave the order, "Fire at your pleasure." What followed was 70 minutes of circling carnage. The two ships spiraled around each other 7 times, starboard broadsides blazing. Alabama fired over 370 rounds. Kearsarge fired 173, but the difference in accuracy was catastrophic. Alabama's gun crews, many weakened by tropical fevers and poor diet, could not match the precision of Kearsarge's well-drilled gunners. Alabama's shells, weakened by degraded powder, struck Kearsarge's hull with dull thuds and failed to explode. One round, from the heavy Blakely rifle, embedded itself in Kearsarge's sternpost. Had it detonated, it would have crippled the ship, destroying her rudder and leaving her helpless, but the fuse was dead. It remains lodged in the sternpost to this day, presented to President Lincoln after the battle. Kearsarge's 11-inch Dahlgren guns, by contrast, were devastating. One shell entered an open gun port and killed or wounded 18 men at a single cannon. Blood ran across the deck in streams. Another punched through Alabama's hull below the waterline. Water flooded the engine room. The fires went out. The ship lost power. As Alabama wallowed, dead in the water, Kearsarge circled for the kill. Semmes ordered full sail and a desperate run for French waters, hoping to beach the ship before she sank. But Alabama was pointed seaward. By the time she completed her turn, water was pouring through a dozen holes in her hull. The ship settled lower with each passing minute. Men abandoned their guns and rushed below to help with the pumps, but it was hopeless. Alabama was dying. "Strike the colors, Mr. Kell," Semmes finally ordered. "It will not do in the 19th century to sacrifice every man we have." The Confederate flag came down. At 12:24 p.m., CSS Alabama sank stern first into 40 fathoms of water. Her mainmast snapped as she went under. Her bow rose high, pointing skyward like a finger of accusation, then slipped beneath the waves. 19 men went down with her. Those who could swim struck out for the boats. Those who couldn't clung to wreckage and prayed for rescue. In the chaos of the sinking, the British yacht Deerhound pulled 42 survivors from the water, including Semmes himself. The captain had thrown his sword into the sea rather than surrender it, then plunged into the water. Rather than deliver them to Kearsarge, the yacht's owner, a Lancashire businessman named John Lancaster, set course for England at full speed. When Winslow demanded the prisoners be turned over, Lancaster refused. They were on British soil now, his yacht, and Britain was neutral. Semmes escaped. He was treated as a hero in Britain, made his way back to the Confederacy through Cuba, and was promoted to Rear Admiral. He commanded ironclads on the James River and briefly held the rank of Brigadier General in the Confederate Army, the only American officer ever to hold both naval and Army general ranks simultaneously. He never commanded a ship in combat again. The sinking of Alabama was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a diplomatic crisis that would reshape international law. The United States demanded reparations from Britain. Alabama had been built in a British shipyard, crewed largely by British sailors and armed with British guns. American diplomats argued that Britain's failure to stop her construction was a violation of neutrality that had prolonged the war and cost millions in destroyed shipping. Senator Charles Sumner went further. He claimed Britain's aid had extended the conflict by 2 years. His estimate for damages, $2 billion, an astronomical sum that exceeded the entire British government budget. Some Americans suggested Britain should simply cede Canada as payment. The British government resisted for years. Alabama had been built legally, they argued. Her guns came from neutral sources. Her crew volunteered freely, but the evidence was overwhelming. British shipyards had built not just Alabama but also CSS Florida and CSS Shenandoah, all of which wreaked havoc on Union shipping. The British government had been willfully blind to the obvious purpose of these vessels. After years of tense negotiation, both nations agreed to submit the dispute to international arbitration. In 1872, a 5-nation tribunal met in Geneva, the first major international arbitration in modern history. The tribunal included representatives from the United States, Britain, Switzerland, Italy, and Brazil. For months, lawyers presented arguments, examined evidence, and debated the meaning of neutrality. The tribunal established a revolutionary principle. Neutral nations have an affirmative duty to prevent violations of neutrality. They must exercise due diligence to stop ships intended for war against nations at peace. Britain was found liable. The award, $15.5 million in gold, one of the largest international damage settlements in history. Britain paid without protest, setting a precedent for peaceful resolution of disputes between great powers. But the true legacy was not financial. The Alabama Claims Arbitration became a model for peaceful dispute resolution. It influenced the Hague Conventions, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and eventually the founding of the League of Nations and the United Nations. The principle of due diligence was codified in international law. Two warships fighting off the coast of France had, in the end, helped create the framework for a more peaceful world. In November 1984, a French minesweeper located Alabama's wreck 60 meters below the surface, 10 kilometers north of Cherbourg. Divers recovered the ship's bell, her Blakely rifle with a shell still in the barrel, and a brass wheel ring inscribed with her motto, Aide-toi et Dieu t'aidera. God helps those who help themselves. The artifacts were distributed between American and French museums. The wreck site, picked clean by treasure hunters over the decades, was finally declared a protected monument in 1989. Today, the site is a protected monument. CSS Alabama captured 65 ships, destroyed $6 million in cargo, drove American shipping into foreign registry, and inspired maritime law that still governs neutral nations today. She fought only one battle against a warship, yet her name became synonymous with Confederate naval power. She was at sea for 534 days out of her 657-day career. She circumnavigated the globe without ever visiting a home port. She steamed over 75,000 miles, the equivalent of circling the Earth 3 times. She took more than 2,000 prisoners without harming a single one. Her captain, Raphael Semmes, remains one of the most controversial figures in American naval history. Celebrated in the South as a hero, condemned in the North as a pirate. He died in 1877, still defending the cause for which he had sailed halfway around the world. The Alabama herself lies where she fell, her bones scattered across the seafloor off Cherbourg, a monument to a war that divided a nation and a ship that terrorized an ocean. The ghost ship of the Confederacy sails no more.